Adin, you were just asking me about what the point is of the interview. Oh, you still
I'm,
there?
I missed the first half of your last sentence.
Oh, no worries. You were just asking me about what what this has to do with the moon, and maybe I should tell you a little bit about the project.
Yeah.
So last December, I got the idea of interviewing a different person every day till the end of 2024, which is when the U.S. is planning to send people back to the surface of the moon for the first
Uh,
time since 1972. And I
okay.
was kind of inspired to do this project by Doug Laverio, who was sort of doing a similar countdown. He was the associate administrator at NASA for the human space flight division, and he
Hmm.
was kind of counting down the days. He's since left the agency. Just a story there, but I plan to continue on with my countdown regardless. So,
All right.
um, but Aiden, before we get into it, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm retired, 76 years old. Uh, I spent the early part of my life as a in technology. I worked for Pratt and Whitney Aircraft. Was my first job out of grad school. Project engineer on jet engine projects, and uh, I got myself out of that at some point. I didn't care for working for such a big organization, and found my way uh, into a small cable TV outfit that was doing marketing for system owners. And this was all on the East Coast. Started, of course, Pratt and Whitney in Connecticut. Uh, Went from there to Sanders Associates up in New Hampshire, which was mostly military electronics uh, program, and then came back to Connecticut uh, with this cable outfit. And uh, after a couple of years at that, uh, our customers, some of them, one of them in particular, called Telecommunications Inc., out of the Denver area, was what they called a multiple system operator. And we were doing uh, marketing projects for them at different locations around the country. And they decided to go in-house with their marketing. So we were going to lose our biggest customer. Uh, and they were they said, well, we're hiring people inside. And so I applied uh, for one of their marketing management positions, and they sent me out to California uh, and worked out of their office in Southern California for a little bit, marketing. There are many systems all around Southern California, from LA out to Yucaipa, down to Oceanside, and everywhere in between. Uh, and after a while of that, one of the people that I hired that worked for me had moved up to the Bay Area, and I hated it in Southern California. Uh, Hated the climate, uh, and uh, uh, this guy I had hired had left, and he had gone to work uh, in San Francisco for a technical post-education school, uh, and they were looking for someone to manage a school in San Jose, and he recommended me. And they contacted me, and I went up and interviewed with them. And I love the Bay Area. and I decided to make that move. So then I lived in the Bay Area and all around the Bay Area. And I had a family all this time, by the way, just a wife and two daughters who were pretty young at that point. But uh, we were in the Bay Area. I was in the Bay Area and went through a divorce after a while, but uh, I was in the Bay Area for 28 years or so. And I met my second wife while I was there. We had another daughter, and we bought a house, lived in Alameda. I don't know if familiar you are with the Bay Area, but it's a community on the East Bay island that's kind of between Oakland and the Bay in San Francisco. Used to be a big naval base there. And we got involved with a local independent church that ultimately was very community focused. And my wife and I got interested in the idea of intentional communities. And we started studying that, and eventually we were looking into and visited a number of intentional communities around the country just to check them out and see how they worked and so forth. And one of the places we ultimately went to visit was a place in Oregon outside of Eugene called Lost Valley Center. And that was it's a 92-acre rural community running a kind of a conference center and for their income, and stewarding a 50-acre recovering forest. And while we were there, they happened to be having a board meeting, and I asked them if I could sit in on the board meeting, which I did. And afterwards, they asked me if I would join the board. Now, at this point in my career, I had shifted totally from the marketing into finance, and I was a financial manager, and had been got to work with a medium-sized company in the Bay Area that was in the commercial industrial HVAC business. So we had offices in San Francisco and in Sacramento, and covered pretty much California and the Northeast. We're mostly engineers representing big manufacturers and reselling their equipment into major projects of various kinds in the Northwest. So while we were doing that, and I bought an old RV, 20-year-old RV from some friends of ours, and we started traveling up and down to Oregon a few times a year to go to those board meetings and learn more about the community and get to know people. And eventually, I decided in the mid-90s, we wanted to travel, and we wanted to. We had our daughter, who was at that point about 12 and a half, was in the middle school, and we decided to. And we had friends in Berkeley who were leaders of a co-op, and we thought, hey, that would be a good interim step for us to get involved in community living without having to leave the area. So our daughter, uh, we took her out of school and started homeschooling her, and we sold our house and moved into this co-op in Berkeley. And at the same time, I'm skipping some steps, but in our business, which had been owned by uh, a bigger company that was in the residential side of the business primarily, they decided they wanted to get out of the commercial industrial. It didn't really fit with their operation. So the then president and one of our guy who ran our Sacramento office and I bought the company from them. So I was a minority part owner of that HVAC business called Tempco. Well, so this was like 96, I guess. I decided to retire. So I sold my share back to the other two partners, and we sold our house. We moved into that co-op in Berkeley, and then we immediately sublet our unit, and we took off in that 20-year-old RV with our daughter for a year-long trip around the country. So that took us, from about July '96 until summer of '97 when we got home. We had traveled around the perimeter of the country, spending time in Canada and various places. We had a wonderful time, and our daughter was 13 years old. We were homeschooling her. And when we got back, we decided to stay there, and we both went to work for nonprofits. My wife and I. She went to work with a nonprofit, the Women's Economic Agenda Project in Berkeley, and I went to work for the Natural Heritage Institute in San Francisco, which was a nonprofit environmental law firm. And I was basically their financial manager and administrative manager with them and then that fall, our daughter started at Berkeley High School. Well, after 1 year at Berkeley High School, my wife and I decided maybe it was time to get out of here. First of all, our daughter was really running wild in Berkeley High. And so that following summer, we called our friends in Oregon at this community and said, we'd like to come up and join the community. And they said, great, come on ahead. So we kidnapped our daughter and took off for Oregon. And we were there for a couple of years, but and my daughter, after she got over the shock of the new environment, and she really loved it there, but she and my wife wanted to go back to California. And I didn't. I had established myself as a participant in a nonprofit up there working on group dynamics, group process facilitation uh, and democratic process called the Co-Intelligence Institute. So we split. My wife and daughter went back, and I stayed. In the interim, we left that community, and I stayed, and we bought. My wife and I together, although she wasn't going to be there, we bought a house in Eugene, which was a 9-bedroom house uh, uh, in a very unique, right near the university, and I started a co-op in that house. So I had other acquaintances and friends who had been interested and were able to uh, get that started, and that co-op is still going. And then through other circumstances, after a couple of years there, I got involved. My wife and I divorced, and I got involved with in 2004 with the Dennis Kucinich presidential campaign, and I became the Oregon campaign manager. And that took me to Portland a lot, and I met some people in Portland, and eventually moved up to Portland, and been here ever since, and continuing with the community organizing work and facilitation work that I had started with Co-Intelligence Institute, and that's what I'm still doing.
That is pretty awesome. And you know, this word intentional community is something that's been bopping around my head a lot recently.
Yeah,
I talked to somebody last week, and we talked about you know, Amish communities as an example of uh,
yeah.
communities that, instead of it being unfettered competition between the participants in the community, as a community as a whole, they kind of decide what technology led into their communities in order to, and how it's going
Mm-hmm.
to change them, and kind of take a more intentional um, approach to it. And I've been kind of thinking about, you know, uh, I mean, I'm kind of interested. So one of the most exciting things about the current era for me is that I feel like we have the technology to really take those first steps in terms of expanding humanity beyond the Earth and creating those
Mm-hmm.
you know, colonies on the moon, on Mars, on the moons of Jupiter, on the moons of Saturn. You know, we could really start expanding out beyond the Earth. But I've been also kind of thinking about who are those people that would actually do that. You know, there's a lot of people who say they want to do that, but I think they have no clue on what that actually is. Because I mean, uh, there's a lot of people who said they wanted to go on a one-way trip to Mars and live there, but I think after being stuck in their house for, you know, 90 days, that they may be kind of anxious to get out, and stuck in a spaceship is far more crippling than being stuck in your house.
Well, not
Um,
only that, but I mean, imagine uh, living on Mars. You're going to be restricted into a man-made environment, uh, which, interestingly enough, are you familiar with the book of The Martian or the film?
yeah, I'm a very big Andy Weir
Okay,
fan. So like Artemis, and also, you know, you've written some short stories, and
yeah,
one of them called The Egg, which kind of talks about the nature of life, if you will. But
uh-huh,
yeah,
yeah. Well, I think there are several, uh, I think, attempts in this, what I guess we would just call the sci-fi world, that have attempted to depict what it might be like to live in a Martian community, city, whatever, and how that might evolve. And Andy did that, his second book, which paints an interesting picture of what that might look like. But I think the people who've had the experience of living here in any of the intentional communities, I think have a lot to contribute from that perspective in terms of how do you organize and co-create a community that is in a restricted environment and that needs to cooperate in survival and development and however it's going to operate. And what, in the case of Mars, of course, there's also the issue of what is the ongoing relationship and so forth with Earth, and God knows what Earth is going to look like when in the next 10 years or so, if you believe that Elon Musk can get there that soon. I mean, his ideas of building a city and ultimately terraforming Mars, I don't have a lot of confidence in it, frankly, although he's been pretty amazing in creating what he has envisioned. But at my stage of life, my wife asked me the other day about if I could take a ride like Bezos and others that are planning on offering people rides into space, either ballistically or in a short orbit. Would I do it? And I said, I think I would, but I don't think I could afford the price that they were going to have to charge to take people as sightseers, basically. But it's kind of an interesting prospect to imagine and think about it.
Indeed. In fact, that's one of the 3 questions I usually ask in this interview is, if it was safe and affordable, would you go? It sounds like the answer in your case is yes, you would.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, to me, it's an experience. If it was available, how could you not?
You'd be amazed. I have had numerous people say they would not. Some of them are afraid of flying, so I mean that's
Oh
not
well,
completely
yeah.
unrealistic. There's
Well,
others.
it's an interesting thing. Just a little side note is that I actually have acrophobia, and I'm afraid of heights if I'm in the, if I'm on the open, like if I'm in the side of. One time I was doing a ropes course, and we were standing on the, waiting for our turn. We were up on the outside on the edge of a cliff, and I was getting palpitations. But when I've ever been enclosed, like if I'm in an airplane and I have flown, I have a student pilot's license that I've never completed, but I totally love that. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition from my point of view. But I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, no, not at all. I actually am in the exact same boat as you. You put me on the edge of a building that's like 5, 6 stories tall, and I'm like pounding. But I also have an unfinished pilot's license in a Cessna 172 that I have no trouble with. And it's only unfinished because I put on hold because of the coronavirus lockdown,
Ah,
and I
well,
haven't quite gotten back into it yet.
well, I hope you do. I hope you do when you can. And uh, I know that uh, I did several flights. I think I have about 15 hours of instruction in my logbook. I ran out of money as part of the reason that I underestimated what it was going to cost me. Uh, but I, it was great fun while I was doing it. And out here, I mean, I had a terrific instructor who, on our first flight together, had me fly up around uh, one of the, we have a chain of mountains running up through here, and Mount St. Helens is one that uh, was a they're all volcanoes actually, but that one blew in the 80s. It was a major thing. But anyway, we flew around Mount St. Helens and checked that out, uh, and that was just enough to give me uh, a an incentive to want to keep going. Uh, and it's challenging. I think it takes a lot of uh, um, dedication and commitment to study, to really, to learn uh, properly good stick and rudder uh, skills. I think that's the most important uh, part of it from my brief, short experience. So I hope you get back to it and make it through your getting your license.
Yeah, I'm. It's one of the biggest things I'm missing. I live right next to the airport, so I see other people flying over me all the time. I'm like, oh,
Oh, that's
really want to
cool.
be there. So
Where are you exactly?
I'm in Houston, Texas. I'm on the north
Oh, you
side.
are in. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. I
Um.
have a nephew that's
Oh.
in Houston.
Does which part of town does he live in?
I don't know. I don't get to talk to him very often. He's pretty much reclusive, but yeah, he's been there for I don't know, a few years now.
So in terms of like the future of humanity, do do you do you see humanity actually branching out beyond the Earth, or do you think we're forever destined to be here?
It's the caveat for me is if we I think it's inevitable that we will branch out if we get our act together here. So uh, right now, I think we're so self-destructive. Uh, uh, it gives me some pause to think, even though Musk and NASA and others will continue to develop as long as we're willing to pay for it, uh, to pay to develop the technology that might make it easier and safer and uh, whatnot. Uh, I fear for our uh, ability to uh, get over our fears of each other and uh, and survive. Plus the challenges. I think, like this pandemic, people have been predicting this for ages, and it finally came, and we act like, gee, how did this happen?
Oh, it's even worse than that, right? I mean, you go and watch Bill Gates' 2015 TED Talk, and you're like, man, this guy really knew his stuff. And so people, then you have people reacting not, oh my gosh, we should have listened to him. They react, oh my gosh, he must have caused it, which is like, hello,
Oh,
that's just crazy.
yeah. Well, that's a good example of what's holding us back from really creating a living environment and community here. Uh, uh, it is, I think, I'm sad to say, a lot of it has to come from our fear of each other on so many levels. Our religious differences and social differences and fear of the other. We still don't want to just notice that we're all human beings. We all live on this planet. We're endangering the planet through a lot of our. You ever hear of the cautionary principle?
Tell me.
The cautionary principle basically simply says, just because we can think of something, we can imagine it, we can create it, we can build it, uh, doesn't mean we should. That we need to consider both whatever we think of in technology. What I've noticed historically is whenever, as some new idea comes along, or a new way, or a new machine, or a new way to use technology, uh, it's sold on the basis of all the wonderful things it might do. But they never want to talk about the what in the pharmaceutical industry they call the contraindications. The side effects, the things that uh, uh, that could happen that might make us at least take pause and say, do we really want to do this? Is it worth the risk of this or that happening? I think nuclear energy is probably the best example.
Well, nuclear energy is definitely one example, but just looking at IT technology, I
Well,
mean,
yeah,
on one hand, I have everybody that I know at a click of a button, but I can't remember a 10-digit number to save my life because I just have to click on their name.
that's right.
Uh,
Yeah, but I mean, the social uh, uh, networks, Facebook and so forth, uh, and the the initial uh, idea of, oh, wouldn't it be so wonderful if you could connect everybody, and everybody had access to all this information, and et cetera, et cetera. Uh, but they forgot to think about what happens if it actually gets taken over by commerce,
right.
and our inability to balance uh, uh, the needs of human beings with the needs of uh, a few human beings uh, making exorbitant profits uh, for what purpose? They don't do anything really useful with it. It's like my biggest pet peeve is the stock markets and all. And I we keep talking about it's been sold as investments, like this is the economy. But when you buy a stock on the market, you're not investing in a company. That money doesn't go to the company to advance whatever it's doing that you might want to support or participate in. All you're doing is uh, paying off someone else who had bought that stock. It's pari mutual betting, you know.
Absolutely.
So
And that's a good point. I mean, if you want to invest in something, go find somebody with a good idea and try to create the situation so you can test it out and prove it. Actually be directly hands-on, or
yeah,
buy a piece of property that needs to be built up, fixed up, and go and
yeah,
fix it up.
and
And those,
and I don't mind the notion of someone who, an entrepreneur who has a great idea for a product or service, whatever, and people invest in that by giving, that uh, entity uh, money, even if they're not directly involved. Although I am also a big supporter of employment, uh, uh, worker-owned companies. If you're familiar with the Mondragon system in the Basque region of Spain, for example, which has been enormously successful for them. But basically, it's the workers own the business, and the employees own the business, and they make the decisions, and they may hire managers and so forth and all. But it's basically the employees. Uh, so so whether it does well or doesn't, everyone's part of it, uh, and reaps part of the benefit or the failure if it doesn't go well. But that's a kind of related to my concept of democratic process that involves the people more directly, direct democracy, and creating systems uh, that involve the people, in our case, the voters, let's say, in having direct influence on the decisions that their representatives, so-called representatives, uh, uh, get to enact. Because uh, I don't think our elected people at any level these days uh, really represent anyone. They just get elected, and then they make decisions based on their own ideas, or their own preferences, or preferences of people who support them, uh, or pay them off, or in one way or another. Uh, and there, to me, it's a dysfunctional system, the way ours has evolved, even though it had wonderful and good intentions. Uh, so part of the work that I've been involved in with the Co-Intelligence Institute is what are ways to move this system to more direct democracy, so that people in the local communities, in the various levels, state and the federal, can really engage and reflect what the people want. Where's the wisdom of the people that gets to make decisions?
well, uh, let's probe
That
the.
will be that will be incredibly critical, I think, in any attempt to create a community on the moon, on the Mars, on or any other extraterrestrial, uh, uh, even a an orbiting city, if that's all we do.
Absolutely. But I'm wondering, it seems to me that our information that we're being fed is sort of self-reinforcing. People get to see more and more of what they already are interested in or already believe, and they see
Hmm.
less and less that challenges them in a constructive way. And
Yeah, it's both. It's both because even though there's a lot of uh, everyone gets to, we're bombarded. That is, the internet is bombarded with every possible point of view and attempt to, but we focus on what we we are attracted to, that reinforces our personal belief system and preferences, uh, and we don't have an opportunity. Uh, we don't take the opportunity or create the opportunity to engage with the real diversity, because this is one of the principles that my colleagues uh, uh, believe very strongly in and try and build in, is the notion that that our differences, the diverse what we consider uh, the opposite point of view, may we're afraid of it, but there's a gift in there. There's a gift in hearing it, uh, and together recognizing, oh, we have these differences. What what's in that that we can use to co-create the best choice for all of us, instead of saying, oh, I disagree with you, I think I have to kill you,
mm,
which is kind of where we seem to have evolved to. So, and I think it's, you know, the earth and certainly the universe has no stake in our survival. The earth is going to be here whether we wipe ourselves out or not.
absolutely.
So, uh, some other, if unless we uh, uh, destroy life totally on the planet, which we're capable of, uh, uh, if we just go extinct ourselves, then other life will continue to evolve uh, for the next 4 billion years, I guess, or so, if that's how long the Earth has to survive uh, with the sun. But who knows? Or I just saw an article about some people have created a new formula to figure out, you know, what's the likelihood of there being other civilizations in the galaxy, and they've come up with that they think there could be somewhere around 35 real, advanced civilizations spread out around the galaxy somewhere, and so maybe one of those will come and take over when we're gone.
Yeah, I mean, it's just amazing if there's R35 advanced civilizations. There's hundreds of millions of worlds just like ours that don't have advanced civilizations.
That's right.
One would ask, why would they be motivated to go to an already occupied place versus just uh, a
It
place
depends
that's.
upon what their motivation is, I guess. And, maybe, there could be just explorers, uh, kind of a Star Trek uh, scenario. Uh, were you a fan, or uh, about the Battlestar Galactica series?
Oh yes, the original and the remake. I've seen pretty
Yeah,
much all of them.
I recently rewatched that whole the series, uh, and uh, it rekindled uh, some thoughts about the notion of, in that case they were forced to, but the idea of finding another planet uh, with the survivors of our own, uh, to try and re-establish uh, human civilization somewhere,
On
and
a place called Earth,
a
apparently.
place called Earth, which actually was not Earth, at least what they were looking for, they found, but it wasn't habitable anymore.
Hmm.
I mean, that so-called the 13th colony uh, had had established, and so they had to go look for another one, and they happened to find the one that we call Earth. So yeah, it was. I thought it was in philosophically, it was a very uh, interesting story, and the idea of creating this race of Cylons, and the Cylons evolve and turn against you. Uh, that's kind of the metaphor for uh, runaway technology that emphasizes or uh, highlights the cautionary principle to me.
Now, you mentioned that you thought eventually we should get off of Earth, but you thought we should take care of our problems here first.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm wondering what you think it would take to take care of our problems here, and also the likelihood of us actually going through those steps.
Well, that is the $64 question, uh, and that's what my colleagues and I have been kind of working on for the last 20 years. What How do we get there? There. This is interesting. I think historically there have always been people who paint the idea of this is the way it ought to be. If only we could live like this, whatever, and have some notion. But what people have never been able to really address is, okay, let's say we said, yes, well, that's the way we want to be. How do we get there from where we are? How do we evolve to that? Uh, and I don't know. Our approach has been to uh, look for and or try and develop notion our notion of how a wise society could operate, and look at what kinds of processes of governance and uh, societal structure would support that, and then what can we do to introduce seeds or establish a momentum in that direction. And I think I'll give you an example. One of the things that we are very engaged with and supportive of is the notion of what we call community councils, dialogue councils, and we've been able to take it to a place where we've had a lot of experimental applications. And the closest we have come to introducing something that approximates that is what's in it happens to be in the state of Oregon, and it's called the boy, my mind is going loose. But basically, it's does Texas have an initiative process? Not every
I
state does.
don't think it does.
Okay, so you know what the states that have that, where you can a group or someone can get a create a ballot initiative on some subject to change the law, change the Constitution, and ask for the institution of some kind of tax or take away a tax, which is what they did in California many years ago, and it's much to their talk about unforeseen consequences. But in Oregon, every 2 years there are ballot initiatives offered, and there are so many that are available, and the state has a commission that under the Secretary of State's office that you have to get so many in signatures in support of it, and then and then they decide whether it qualifies for the next ballot. And usually what happens is there's a big anti group, and then there's a big pro group, often supported by a lot of corporate money, because the initiatives often have to do with corporate issues, and they're advertising. They're each throwing a lot of advertising on, trying to convince people what to do about it. And so we said, well, what if we just took a group, a randomly selected but representative group of the voters, and we brought them together with facilitators and gave them a week to, number one, examine a particular one ballot initiative, to get presentations and support. It would be almost like the Supreme Court. They'd be like a Supreme Court sitting and hearing arguments from the different sides. And
Or
they could,
grand jury, maybe.
yeah, and they could do research. They could have, they could ask questions and say, well, I want to know what this impact, or show me the research behind that supports this or that, and then have a facilitated conversation among this group of citizens. And then at the end, this was among themselves. This is their conversation, and they would come to some decision about, do we think this is a good initiative to support or not? And they don't even have to all agree. They could just have a vote among themselves, and then that information uh, would then be made available to all the voters in Oregon. They have a voter guide before every election that comes out that has everything that's on the ballot and all the candidates and their statements and whatever, and then the pros and cons that have been offered by the different sides on each initiative. And all we were suggesting is that the results of this council of ordinary citizens would also be published in the guide so that other voters had an opportunity to hear or read, in this case, what a group of their neighbors, a diverse, demographically representative of all the people in the state, uh, what they came up with when they were able to really examine it carefully and talk about it openly among themselves. Because that's something we don't do. We listen to the advertising, but we don't really talk to each other about anything. We just get influenced by the biased sides. So we were actually able to get that instituted in the after with enormous opposition. This is very surprising. I mean, it seems so harmless. What could go wrong? But it was interesting to see who objected. Lobbyists objected because that would mean people didn't have to listen to lobbyists. And any case, it's been probably 5 years. They've done several sessions. It unfortunately doesn't get, the state doesn't make a big show of it. So a lot of people don't even know it's there, but it's happened. And so this is an example of one way that we've tried to institute just the notion, at least, because it has no power to do anything. It's just it's just information from a more trustworthy source, right? That's the intention. And so there it is. It still has opposition, certainly from all the invested people on one side or another. So the biggest surprise to me was when we were trying to get it through the legislature to set up a commission that would oversee the implementation of it. And it's called the Citizens Initiative Review.
There's a sci-fi story written by Frederick Pohl that talks about a system similar to what you're saying, set up in like New York, and I think you'd really appreciate some of the details he's put into his story. I have to send you the link to
I'll
it.
check that out. Frederick Pohl?
Yeah, Pohl. I think it's from his collection of stories called Day 1 Million.
Huh.
But I'll send you the link to the actual story.
Great, I appreciate that.
But
So that to me, that's an example of one way to start to implement that. And interestingly enough, the most successful versions of this kind of process so far have not been in the United States. There's a region, a city in Germany and in Austria, etc., that are doing similar things on just issues generally. citizen deliberative councils uh, to help the the local governments decide what to do about whatever particular issue is up before that particular jurisdiction. Uh, uh, and and those are that's looks like it's expanding into more and more areas. And there we have colleagues now in England and that are moving that kind of thing more and more. So interestingly enough, it's happening. Uh, it's being accepted more as something to experiment with, at least in Europe. But the resistance here, it's like the resistance to doing away with uh, the electoral college and have the president just elected by the uh, uh, so, I mean, the vote majority of the actual raw vote directly by the people. The resistance to that uh, is interesting, and I think it's the people who are afraid that they can't win, that they can't, and I mean, you've heard Trump say, hey, if we allow mail-in voting, no Republican will ever get elected again. Well, what is that telling you?
Republicans don't know how to use the mail.
Well, they don't. They don't. People people realize, or at least experience, that the Republicans are not uh, operating when they are in power to our benefit. Otherwise, they'd vote for them. And if they're not voting for them, there are always some that will. And these are mostly people who I think are living in some fear-based uh, paradigm, whether it's religiously based, which is another fascinating uh, area to explore, or socially based. Fear of poor people, fear of uh, uh, people of color, fear, because that's what underlies racism. Uh,
Well, my
uh,
biggest fear is afraid of people that are afraid. So it's kind of
yeah,
self-reinforcing.
yeah. And as Roosevelt said, we have nothing to fear but fear itself.
We have a lot to fear.
Yeah, we do.
Um, if you look at the people that came over to North America from Europe, a lot of those people were looking to set up their own communities based upon their own rules that they felt like they couldn't do inside of Europe.
Yeah,
And also, a lot of people who came over here and were really, really successful, there's some um, thoughts that they came over here to seize that opportunity. And I recently had a chance to go to Edinburgh and see some of the uh, history of Carnegie and um, kind of Andrew Carnegie and his family. And the thing that really struck me the most from the exhibits I saw was that they had Andrew Carnegie's parents were weavers, and they recently had bought like three looms, which essentially cost all their fortune right as the power loom got, uh, these manual looms, right as the power
mhm.
loom became um, in service. So essentially, they lost their business, and uh, Andrew Carnegie's mother made the point in, I guess, her diary or the biography or whatever, that they came over to America not because they thought it had better opportunity, because they had no opportunity in Scotland, and it was
Mhm.
essentially, they were forced to come over here.
Yeah,
And I'm thinking, if you consider what life on the solar frontier is going to be like, on the moon, in free space, in on Mars. I mean, you're talking about being it's probably not going to be luxurious in any sense the word. In fact, it's probably going to be, you're going to be on the very edge of survival. You're going to have catastrophe. You're going to have your fellow citizen going insane and doing crazy stuff. You're going to have meteors. You're going to have radiation. It's not going to be a good place to be. So, you know, in some ways, I wonder, is it possible for us to move out into the rest of the solar system unless it really becomes so bad here that people feel like there's no alternative?
Well, that can be a strong motivation, uh, and it would be sad to me if that's what it took, because it's like uh, the alternative is that we just all feel engaged in the process of exploration uh, and our, whether we go directly ourselves, and some people are more adventurous or more willing to take those risks, uh, not not from a fear perspective, uh, or for a lack of something else, uh, a better way to live, but purely from a creative, it's part of their, I believe that every human being is born with some innate gifts that they and all we what we should what would benefit society most, whether it's global or local, is if if we focused on helping each individual discover and nurture their creative gifts so that they can then contribute uh, the unique uh, gifts that they have to offer, uh, and the fact that they're different for different people is a good thing. The diversity has innate gifts in it that I think we need for survival. Evolutionary. That it's been the unique uh, gifts of uh, mutations or whatever in the genes, uh, whatever that have led to improvements, or if you will, in the species, and contributed more to the survival of the species. Uh, uh, and so I would hope that we can come to our expansion into the solar system, at least, uh, uh, from that point of view, from that perspective, rather than from, oh God, things are so terrible here, I might as well go and risk my life on Mars or somewhere. So uh, uh, I'd rather think along those lines than spend energy considering the the negative, where it's a forced choice, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, me too. And in fact, I mean, I think the challenges are such, we don't have solutions to the problems necessary in order to make it happen. And we
Yeah,
need to be able to bring more minds, uh, to attack those
yeah,
problems.
yeah, and minds that uh, aren't constrained in the boxes that we create. I mean, people like, with all his faults, Elon Musk is an incredibly creative force. And I think, when you look at how he's really transformed uh, the uh, uh, the automobile business uh, in and forced uh, well, let's put it this way: he's created an opportunity for market pressure to force the the staid traditional thinking uh, automobile companies, the established ones, that this is really what people want, and we better get there too if we're going to stay alive. Uh, and I think that's an example of where the traditional way of doing things ultimately uh, folds back on itself, and it loses the real creativity uh, uh, that could advance their business. There's no reason why the auto companies couldn't have done this themselves. They certainly had the resources. There's no reason why the oil companies uh, couldn't be the leaders in developing solar power and renewable energy sources instead of fighting it. You know, uh, and so it's there. It's they they create the circumstances of their own uh, demise by resisting and turning away from that kind of real creativity that they should be uh, nurturing in their own organizations, in their own industry.
Yeah, I hear it's a popular business school joke that if Union Pacific understood it was in the transportation industry and not in the iron rail industry, we would all be
Yeah,
flying Union Pacific Airlines.
exactly.
So,
Yeah, and interestingly enough, even as I noticed this in the oil companies, they're trying to say, well, no, we're really in the energy business, you know, uh, but they resist taking that real seriously. It's like they want to be able to control it, uh, uh, and so they end up.
it reminds me of that
Someone
Godfather.
else comes along and says, "Hell with you! I mean, I'm going to do it." Like Elon Musk did with the Tesla, and now batteries. He's going to his development uh, now with battery technology is going to he's going to end up with, I think, a monopoly kind of on really good, efficient, uh, low cost battery technology that is going to transform the way we use and distribute uh, energy.
Oh,
So,
exactly. I mean, these big solar and wind farms having big set battery packs right next to them to kind of act as a buffer and allow for
right,
those systems to have a continuous supply of energy coming out of them,
right,
make everything else easier. But
exactly.
your comment about oil and gas companies and them embracing the concept that they're energy
You
companies,
are
but
in
not
Houston.
while they're not really embracing it, reminded me of a Godfather quote about keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer.
Yeah, yeah,
So, um,
yeah. Well, I think there's also this is uh, a commentary from my own experience on the corporate mentality in the corporate system, uh, uh, which is that the uh, uh, corporations become uh, stuck in uh, their own systems. And again, it's fear, fear of competition, fear of and control. The idea that we have to control everything, even if we have to uh, uh, hold back the the truth and progress that we may already know, but we don't, we don't want to. The automobile companies, uh, they're afraid. What are they going to do with all of their gasoline and diesel technology and engines and factories that are all uh, geared for that uh, in the face of this? So they don't want to change too quickly uh, because they don't want to lose that business. And your old companies, I think, were in the same, are still, I think, in the same boat. So, well, we'll go with natural gas. We'll say natural gas. We'll keep coal. We can we can make coal clean coal. You know, they'll do anything to try and hang on to that technology because it's such a heavy investment that they have uh, in that, which is, and it's not just the financial investment because they're making enormous profits, uh, and they could have used those profits instead of overpaying by billions of dollars. All their so-called executives, who are the same people that are holding them back and thinking that it's important for their, that this is supports their share value because that's the way they compensate executives. Now, the market be damned. That's really why it's so important for them to keep their shares up, not for their general stockholders, but because the management is all compensated with stock. So their compensation, their incentive is to make that more and more valuable. Yeah, it's a bizarre system if you really look at it.
I know, and we're kind of all tied into it now with so many people's retirement funds kind of you in the stock market, and
Hmm.
it's really a difficult thing to unwind.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the control process. I think this is where corporations try and control their environment, control the finances, and now it's the country, the corporations themselves are are under the major influence and control of the financial markets, which
Absolutely.
have nothing to do with the economy,
Well, I
really.
mean, if you need a proof of that, just look at the past 2 or 3 months.
There you go. Yeah, because they can the stock market, the players in the stock market, they continue. They don't care about up, down. Doesn't really matter. You know, they're going to buy when it goes down. They'll buy, and because they expect it's going to it's going to go up again. Then they'll sell it and wait for it to go down again. They're just playing a numbers game. It it it, it doesn't contribute anything to the markets of goods and services that the real economy that affects people's lives uh, is uh, is contributing to.
It may not contribute, but I think we could maybe make the argument it detracts from, because it takes really smart
Yeah,
people who are great problem solvers and have them focused on how to optimize this thing that's not
yeah,
contributing. And then
yeah,
also it's kind of a demotivational thing in the sense that people who would have been happy making a real contribution are now sort of on the negative end of a social dynamic where they're marginalized
mhm,
or looked down upon because they don't they're not winning out from the financial picture in
exactly,
the same way. So
exactly. That's very good. Good thinking. Uh, uh, it's kind of ironic. I mean, these are the creative people are putting their creativity into figuring out formulas to predict the stock market instead of, you know,
Instead of maybe the weather, which actually would be useful.
yeah, good example.
But I like to think of humanity as being sort of like a sphere, and on the outside of that sphere, you have the natural world. The
Mm,
mining, the learning the laws of nature, the actually generating resources, and what have you. And then inside the sphere is sort of our own um, human problems, our politics, our economics, and what have
mm,
you. And as that sphere gets bigger, you have people on the inside of that sphere that are further and further away from the actual real world. And I think you ultimately have like an implosion when you have people making the wrong choices and decisions that are completely out of alignment with reality, that it's just unsustainable. And then at some point it collapses back down and we're all like
mm.
trying to get crops to grow out of the ground again, and we're back in the real world.
Yeah, and yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think that's the whole we 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 this notion of power and control uh, has become the essence of what we think of as progress and the way things have to be or things should be, and it's partly from greed and the fact that uh, what we what we do learn the people who have really studied nature, for example, and at various levels, and they've learned, things like uh, uh, how how spiders produce silk, or uh, and uh, and the medicinal qualities of various plants. Uh, then it gets into our system as well. How can we make a fortune from that?
Exactly. I mean, it's beautiful in itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think uh, 60 Minutes last night had a segment about the pharmaceutical companies and the opioid producers, and uh, how they basically just violated the law in how they uh, to market and encourage find doctors who are vulnerable and paying them off to prescribe more and more and higher doses, uh, and uh, it's with no consequences. Even when they were caught, it was treated as a misdemeanor or something, and they'd made billions of dollars in profit, and then they pay, $500 million fine, and hey, that's a pretty good trade for them. Uh, until finally, this 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 one, they finally uh, were able to gather enough evidence to convict them of racketeering, and all. It's unbelievable what they were doing, uh, and how their salespeople were paying, basically bribing doctors to prescribe more and higher dosage, and they would put pressure on them, uh, uh, and meanwhile people were getting addicted and dying, and having enormous consequences, and these guys were making you know millions of dollars personally, but uh, you know finally somebody with some integrity in the FDA investigatory system was able to break through and get these guys uh, indicted and charged, and ultimately, the evidence they had was so open and shut, the juries just sent these guys as the management and the salespeople and all of them are in prison now. And I don't know what they did with the. I think they had to. Oh, I know this one guy who actually turned state's evidence. He was kind of the key to opening the door to the investigators. Uh, he got off of a lighter sentence, but he had to return all of the money he was paid. So I don't know if that's enough of a disincentive now to impact all the other pharmaceutical. I mean, the company is obviously out of business, but when it was first going, it was a big high flyer on the stock market. You know, it was, which is just another example. Nobody looked beyond, the early big profits that they were making to see what were they really doing anything legal. It's the stock market doesn't care. So here we are, and all of this I think has an impact on ultimately on whether we're ever going to go anywhere
It's
again.
it's true. I mean, at least together, I think as long as you create the ability for somebody to go somewhere, you'll have people go there, and maybe
Oh,
they'll
sure.
set up communities along different lines, and we kind of have like a renewed, and they work out better, and then that kind of maybe back propagates to us. But I wanted to go back to intentional communities. If you were to define what an intentional community was, what are the
Uh,
characteristics of it?
yes, I would describe it as a a community that is created by the people together, and it is managed uh, and run for their cooperative benefit. And they make, they, lots of them that I've had contact with use a consensus kind of governance system, which I think is, if used and implemented the way consensus really is intended, can be very effective for everyone. But the experience I had living in intentional communities taught me that you need a real understanding and commitment to the process to make it work. Otherwise, if people come in with some idealized notion of the way it's going to be, like they'll know, well, there's no conflict, there's no, you know, they get disillusioned very quickly. And then it's hard because the community is in constant flux, because people come, they get upset, then they leave, and then you got new people coming in, and then they have different ideas about how they want to do things, so they don't adopt the culture that that was established to begin with, and so that creates more conflict, and it's challenging, but it can also be incredibly successful, and the community that I lived in at for a while, Lost Valley Center, is still going. It's doing well. The co-op that I created in Eugene, the Walnut Street Co-op, is still going. In fact, the founder of the Co-Intelligence Institute, who I started working with, he moved into the co-op some years ago, and he's still there. And we call it's now become the galactic headquarters of the Co-Intelligence Institute, uh, uh, which basically consists of a bunch of people that we are colleagues, but are not part of the institute itself. The institute is basically Tom Atlee, who's our founder, thinker, and moving force, and those of us that support it and participate in the various parts of it, in experiments and projects and so forth, while we have other means of support in our society, because the Institute couldn't possibly support a lot of people with the income, all of which is donations. I think our biggest annual income is probably around $75,000. And Tom, because he's in the co-op, he gets his salary, or his income anyway, because half of it is the rent and food allowance that the co-op collects. But he gets $500 a month basic salary, and then he's essentially getting his food and board free, because the institute is paying to the co-op for that space. That's the office, and also covers his participatory food allowance. So we're not a highly visible financial operation, but we think, we believe in the work that we've been doing, and if you're interested, you could check out a couple of Tom's books. One's called The Tao of Democracy, TAO, Tao. And the other one, I always forget the official book title. Where are we? Oh, come on, Tom. Oh, well. Oh, yeah. Empowering Public Wisdom.
And I was wondering if you had any recommendations in learning more about intentional communities, and how they're set up, how they maintain sort of their rigidity in terms of their intention.
There's an organization called the Fellowship for Intentional Communities, FIC. That's got, I assume it's still going, because the intentional communities are, and that would be the best source of connections. They used to publish, they probably still do, it's probably online now, the Directory of Intentional Communities, which has articles and a directory of intentional communities around the world, not just in the US. And then kind of what I have considered, because it was the first book that that we explored when we were first starting to get interested, is called Builders of the Dawn. Community Builders of the Dawn. Community Lifestyles in a Changing World. It's Corinne McLaughlin and Gordon Davidson, the authors. And wow, this is published in 1985. And this came.
It'd be interesting to see. I mean, back then, communication technologies allowed for a group of people to sort of create an intentional community and not be constantly bombarded by the outside world. But communication technologies now are such that there's no place on earth that you can kind of escape it.
True, and yet there's a very diverse I don't know, kind of intentional communities. There are some that are spiritually focused. There are some that are economically focused. There's the whole co-housing movement, which started in Scandinavia. And the rural ones. There are some that try and be totally self-sufficient. You know, they grow their own food. They're off the grid, and it's impossible to be totally disconnected from the outside world, as you say. But I'm just saying there's a range. There's of communities that take on a lot of different forms that, you know, it's the diversity of people. You know, people come together around what's our guiding principle that we're trying to create for our community, and they vary quite a bit. So there's lots of alternatives to look at, and I think you'll find that if you get to the Fellowship for Intentional Communities. When I first started looking at them, I remember being surprised at how many there were, and they, you know, some are very religious initially, and probably did come from the Amish and other religiously focused communities that tried to establish and sustain themselves, which is a challenge. And I think it's an ongoing challenge for intentional communities. The co-housing movement, which is kind of where people come together and essentially they build a community that of houses around a particular design principle that encourages interaction, limits automobiles in the center, and they that was kind of the initial approach, and it was collectively governed, and yet legally they usually had to set up like a condominium structure because that's the way the law would recognize them. So that created challenges of its own, uh, because they didn't want to operate necessarily the way a condominium association would have to, but but they found ways to uh, uh, make that work. Um, so uh, yeah, I think the FIC covers everything, covers all the alternatives, and just going through their directory, whether it's online or they used to publish an annual directory, you know, book, uh, uh, and I haven't seen that for a while, so I'm guessing they just decided just do it all online. It's easier to keep it updated, and it's even
And cheaper.
more. It's cheaper and it's more easily accessible, uh, by for the most people who might be interested. Uh, so that would be the best source, I think.
I definitely have to check it out. In fact,
Yeah,
I have
please do.
another 1,600 plus days of interviews to get through, so might
I know
might
I'm
be.
taking up probably a lot more of your lunchtime than uh, you would like, but it's been very enjoyable.
I really enjoyed it too. I got a lot out of it, and it was so good to meet you.
I'm sorry. I'm going to let you go. My wife is calling me.
Sounds good. Bye.
Hi there.